Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is the same person who saves your life years later. Emily Carter tightened her grip on her 6-year-old daughter's hand as the crowded airport terminal buzzed around them with rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and impatient travelers rushing toward their gates. Lily leaned sleepily against her side, clutching a faded pink backpack that looked almost too worn for another trip. Emily checked the time again on her cracked phone screen and quietly swallowed the panic building in her chest. Their flight from Chicago to Seattle was boarding in less than 20 minutes, and her credit card had already been declined twice at the self-check kiosk. She forced herself to smile down at Lily anyway. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "Mom's figuring it out." But the truth was, she had no idea what to do next. The past year had been brutal. 2 part-time jobs still weren't enough to cover rent, daycare, groceries, and the medical bills left from Lily's asthma treatments last winter. Emily hadn't slept more than 4 straight hours in months. Even now, dark circles sat under her tired blue eyes, and the sleeve of her coat was slightly frayed near the wrist. Around her, businessmen in expensive jackets typed on sleek laptops, while families carried shopping bags from luxury stores inside the terminal. Emily suddenly felt painfully visible, like everyone around her could somehow see every unpaid bill sitting on her kitchen counter back home. "Mom," Lily asked quietly, "are we not flying anymore?" Emily's chest tightened instantly at the fear in her daughter's voice. She crouched slightly, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind Lily's ear. "We are," she lied gently. "Just give Mommy 1 second, okay?" She turned back toward the airline counter and handed over the card one more time. The employee tried again before offering the same uncomfortable expression Emily had seen too many times lately. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the woman said carefully. "It's still not going through." Emily felt heat rush into her cheeks as several people in line shifted impatiently behind her. One man sighed loudly. Another woman glanced at Emily's old suitcase with quiet judgment before looking away. Emily quickly reached for the card, her hands trembling slightly now. I might have another one," she muttered, digging through her purse while silently praying there was still at least enough room left on her backup card to get them home. But before she could find it, a calm male voice spoke from behind her. "Put it on my account." Emily froze completely. Something about that voice hit her like a memory she'd spent years trying to bury. Slowly, she turned around. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark charcoal coat that looked simple until you noticed how perfectly tailored it was. His jaw was sharper now, his hair slightly darker than she remembered, and faint lines near his eyes hinted at years she hadn't witnessed. But none of that mattered, because she would have recognized those eyes anywhere. Ethan Brooks, her first love, the man who disappeared from her life 12 years ago without a goodbye. For a second, the noise of the airport seemed to disappear entirely. Emily couldn't breathe. Ethan looked at her with the same stunned expression, as though he couldn't believe she was real either. Then his gaze slowly dropped toward Lily standing beside her. Something unreadable flickered across his face before he looked back at Emily again. "Emily," he said softly, almost like the name still belonged to him. She felt her heart crack open in the worst possible way. Because after all these years, after all the nights she spent hating him for leaving, part of her still remembered exactly how it felt to love him. Emily stared at Ethan as if the last 12 years had collapsed into a single painful second. He looked older now, more controlled, more polished, but his eyes were still the same deep shade of blue she used to lose herself in when they were teenagers sitting on the hood of his old pickup truck outside her parents' house in Ohio. Back then, Ethan Brooks had not worn expensive coats or carried himself with quiet authority. He had been the boy who worked weekends at a gas station, the boy who used to split milkshakes with her at a 24-hour diner because neither of them could afford to. Emily remembered the nights they spent talking about impossible dreams while sharing fries and bad coffee under flickering neon lights. Ethan wanted to build something big someday. Emily wanted a small house with a porch swing and enough peace to hear crickets at night. For a long time, they believed they would have both together. "Mom," Lily whispered, pulling gently on Emily's sleeve. Emily blinked quickly, forcing herself back to reality. Ethan's attention shifted toward the little girl again. He studied her face for only a second before looking back at Emily with careful restraint, like he was holding back questions he did not know how to ask. The airline employee awkwardly cleared her throat. Sir, would you still like to cover the ticket? Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off Emily. Yes. Emily immediately shook her head. No. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Several people nearby glanced over again. Embarrassment flooded her chest. Ethan remained calm. Emily, he said quietly. It is just a plane ticket. She crossed her arms tightly. I can handle it myself. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them felt old and familiar, like reopening a wound that had never healed correctly. Then Lily looked up at Ethan with innocent curiosity. Are you Mommy's friend? Emily's stomach twisted instantly. Ethan's expression softened in a way she had not expected. A long time ago, he answered gently. Lily smiled slightly. Mommy does not have a lot of friends. Emily closed her eyes briefly in humiliation. Lily, what? The little girl asked innocently. Ethan looked away for a second, almost as though that small sentence had affected him more than it should have. Finally, he handed his black credit card to the employee anyway. Please, he said calmly. Take care of it. Emily wanted to argue again, but exhaustion won. She was too tired to fight, too tired to pretend she still had control over everything falling apart in her life. A few minutes later, they walked silently toward security together. Ethan rolled Lily's tiny pink suitcase beside him while Emily carried her worn tote bag over one shoulder. The sight felt strangely wrong and strangely natural at the same time. You disappeared, she finally said without looking at him. Ethan slowed slightly beside her. Emily, 12 years, she continued quietly. You vanished for 12 years. His jaw tightened. I know. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Do you? The memory still lived inside her like a scar. 1 week before Ethan was supposed to leave for New York after graduation, he had promised her nothing would change between them. He kissed her forehead that night under summer fireworks and told her he loved her. Then 3 days later, he stopped answering her calls completely. By the end of the month, he was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. Emily had spent weeks crying herself to sleep beside a phone that never rang. Then, 2 months later, she discovered she was pregnant. Ethan suddenly stopped walking. Emily turned slightly, confused, before realizing Lily had wandered a few feet ahead toward the large airport windows overlooking the runway. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the child while she laughed softly at the sight of a plane taking off into the cloudy evening sky. Something unreadable crossed his face again. Then he looked back at Emily very slowly. How old is your daughter? He asked quietly. Emily's heartbeat immediately stumbled inside her chest. Emily swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady as she answered. She is 6 years old. Lily. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the little girl as she twirled slightly in her worn shoes, oblivious to the tension between them. The memory of her own childhood laughter with Ethan seemed to linger in the way Lily tilted her head toward him, curious and unafraid. Emily felt an unexpected pang in her chest, a mix of fear, resentment, and something she had long tried to ignore, longing. She tried to pull herself together, adjusting Lily's backpack and reminding her to stay close. But every step she took beside Ethan felt like walking on a tightrope over memories she had never been able to reconcile. She has your eyes, Ethan murmured softly, almost to himself, and Emily's stomach twisted at the sound. Her first instinct was to deny it, to brush it off as coincidence, but there was a truth in his voice that made her heart pound with uncomfortable clarity. Do not start with that, she said quietly, though her words lacked conviction. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, unyielding yet careful, like he was weighing whether to cross a line he had avoided for over a decade. The loudspeaker called their flight again, pulling them both toward the gate, but neither moved immediately. Emily felt the weight of 1,000 questions she had kept locked away, questions she had whispered into her pillow at night for years. Why did he leave? Did he ever think about her? Did he even know she was carrying his child? Each step toward the boarding line was heavy with the past and present colliding. Ethan maintained a respectful distance, but there was a protective aura about him she had not remembered, the same way he had once shielded her from the teasing boys at school, but now magnified, almost regal. As they reached the security checkpoint, Lily tugged on Emily's hand. Mommy, look, she said, pointing at the large observation windows where airplanes taxied and lifted into the bright afternoon sky. Emily forced a smile, trying to mask the swirl of emotions threatening to spill over. Ethan crouched slightly to Lily's level and smiled genuinely, his expression softening in a way that made Emily catch her breath. "Do you like planes?" he asked. Lily nodded enthusiastically, and Ethan ruffled her hair gently, careful not to overstep. Emily observed silently, her heart both warming and aching at the same time. The lines on his face, the quiet strength in his movements, the way he interacted with her daughter as though instinctively understanding her needs. It stirred feelings she had spent years burying. As they proceeded through security, Emily could not stop stealing glances at him. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to control, someone who had navigated the world successfully while she had struggled to stay afloat. She caught a glimpse of his tailored coat brushing against his polished shoes and felt a pang of envy mixed with awe. How had life taken them on such different paths? She kept herself composed outwardly, but inside, her emotions were a tempest. Every gesture, every look, and every unspoken word seemed to communicate volumes. For a fleeting moment, she imagined what it would have been like if things had gone differently 12 years ago. Ethan noticed the subtle tremor in her hands as she adjusted Lily's small backpack. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice carrying concern without intrusion. Emily blinked rapidly and nodded, pushing back tears that she did not want to reveal. "I am fine," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Ethan offered a small, understanding smile and allowed her space, but the weight of unspoken words hung heavily between them. Lily skipped ahead, giggling at a reflection in the glass, and Emily followed, silently realizing that nothing about this encounter would be ordinary, and that the bridge between the past and the present had just begun to form under the bright lights and the constant hum of the airport. The boarding area was crowded and noisy, but Emily felt strangely isolated sitting beside Ethan after all those years. Lily sat between them in one of the airport chairs, happily coloring in a small activity book while kicking her tiny sneakers back and forth. Ethan watched her quietly for a moment before glancing toward Emily again. "She is smart," he said softly. Emily gave a faint nod. "She reads above her grade level." Pride warmed her voice despite her exhaustion. "She loves science and airplanes." Ethan smiled slightly. "Sounds familiar." Emily looked away immediately because the comment hit too close to memories she did not want surfacing. Years ago, Ethan used to drag her outside during thunderstorms just to watch lightning patterns and talk about engineering dreams that sounded impossible for two broke teenagers from Ohio. Back then, he used to believe he could change the world someday. Emily had believed him. An announcement suddenly echoed across the terminal. Their flight had been delayed due to severe weather near Denver. Groans filled the gate area instantly. Emily closed her eyes in frustration. "No," she whispered under her breath. She had barely enough money left for a rideshare after landing in Seattle, and every extra hour in the airport meant more expenses she could not afford. Lily leaned against her arm sleepily. "Mommy, I am hungry." Emily forced another smile, even though anxiety twisted painfully in her chest. "I know, sweetheart." She reached into her purse and quietly counted the few dollar bills she had left. Ethan noticed immediately. Without saying anything, he stood up. "I will be right back." Emily frowned slightly. "Ethan, you do not have to. I know." He interrupted gently before walking away. 10 minutes later, he returned carrying sandwiches, apple juice, fruit cups, and a stuffed teddy bear Lily instantly fell in love with. "For the traveler," he said lightly, handing it to her. Lily's face lit up with pure joy. "Thank you," she exclaimed before hugging the bear tightly against her chest. Emily watched the interaction carefully, torn between gratitude and discomfort. Ethan sat back down beside them as though none of it was a big deal. But to Emily it was, because nobody had quietly taken care of her in a very long time. She handed Lily her sandwich before lowering her voice. "You should not spend money on us." Ethan looked genuinely confused by the statement. "Emily, it is food." She stared down at her hands. Still, for a second, silence settled between them again. Then Ethan spoke carefully. "You always hated accepting help." Emily gave a weak laugh. "Life teaches you things." His expression darkened slightly at that answer. Before he could respond, a sharply dressed airport employee approached Ethan directly. "Excuse me, sir," the woman said politely. "We have prepared the private lounge accommodations for your wait." Emily looked up immediately, confused. Ethan barely reacted. "Thank you." he answered calmly. The employee glanced toward Emily and Lily. Will your guests be joining you? Emily blinked. Guests? Ethan stood smoothly. Yes. Emily frowned harder now. Private lounge, she repeated once the employee walked away. Ethan slipped one hand into his coat pocket casually. It is quieter there for Lily. Emily stared at him suspiciously. What exactly do you do now? Ethan paused for the first time since seeing her. Business, he answered simply. That is not an answer. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It is the only one I have right now. Emily followed him reluctantly through the terminal with Lily beside her. The farther they walked, the more uncomfortable she became. They passed crowded seating areas and busy food courts before arriving at a quiet frosted glass entrance guarded by a receptionist in a tailored Navy uniform. The woman immediately smiled at Ethan. Welcome back, Mr. Brooks. Emily stopped walking. Her eyes slowly shifted toward him. Mr. Brooks. The receptionist spoke to him with the kind of respect reserved for powerful people. Ethan noticed the look on Emily's face, but said nothing. Then the receptionist opened the doors to an elegant private lounge filled with leather chairs, marble counters, and floor-to-ceiling runway views unlike anything Emily had ever seen before. Lily gasped softly beside her. But Emily barely noticed the luxury around them anymore, because one terrifying thought had suddenly entered her mind. She no longer believed Ethan was simply doing well. Emily stepped into the private lounge cautiously, almost afraid she did not belong there. The soft lighting, quiet piano music, and polished marble floors felt like an entirely different world from the crowded terminal outside. Lily stared wide-eyed at the massive windows overlooking the runway while hugging her teddy bear tightly against her chest. Mommy, this place is fancy, she whispered loudly enough to make Emily flush with embarrassment. Ethan smiled faintly. I think she likes it. Emily folded her arms tightly. I think I do not understand what is happening. Ethan gestured toward a seating area near the windows. Sit down for a minute. She hesitated before finally lowering herself onto the leather sofa, painfully aware of how worn her coat looked against the expensive furniture. Ethan sat across from her instead of beside her, giving her enough space to breathe, but his presence still filled the room in a way she could not ignore. Lily quickly wandered toward a dessert counter nearby, fascinated by tiny pastries lined up neatly beneath glass displays. Emily immediately stood halfway. Lily, do not touch anything. A lounge attendant smiled warmly. It is all complimentary, ma'am. Emily sank back slowly, uncomfortable all over again. Ethan noticed every reaction on her face. You do not need to look so nervous, he said gently. Easy for you to say. He leaned back slightly. Why? Emily stared at him for a second before quietly laughing without humor. Because people like me do not end up in places like this. Ethan's expression changed instantly. People like you? Emily looked away toward the runway lights outside the glass. Single mothers with maxed-out credit cards and discount luggage. Her voice stayed calm, but Ethan heard the exhaustion buried underneath every word. He watched her carefully for several seconds before speaking again. You used to dream bigger than anyone I knew. Emily gave a faint smile that vanished almost immediately. Dreams are expensive. The answer hit him harder than she expected. Silence settled between them while Lily happily picked out a chocolate chip cookie from the dessert table. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the child again, and Emily noticed how naturally his attention followed her every movement. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. So, she finally said quietly, what kind of business gives someone private airport lounges? Ethan rubbed his jaw slightly, almost buying time. Technology. Emily frowned. Technology is a very broad answer. It is still accurate. She shook her head. You always do that. Do what? Avoid questions when you do not want to tell the truth. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. Some things are complicated. Emily's chest tightened. Funny. That sounds familiar too. The tension between them thickened instantly. Ethan looked like he wanted to say something else, but before he could, a man in a dark suit entered the lounge carrying a tablet. He walked directly toward Ethan with visible urgency. Sir, the Singapore investors moved the call up by 40 minutes. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. Ethan stood immediately. I will handle it. The man lowered his voice respectfully. The board is also asking whether you approve the acquisition announcement. Emily froze at the word board. Ethan glanced briefly toward her before answering calmly. Not now, Daniel. Of course, Mr. Brooks. The man nodded politely and walked away. Emily slowly looked back at Ethan once they were alone again. Investors? She repeated quietly. Ethan exhaled softly. Emily, bored, she added. Acquisition announcement. Lily returned at that moment carrying 2 cookies and climbed onto the sofa beside Emily, completely unaware of the storm building around her. Ethan remained standing, one hand in his coat pocket, looking suddenly less like the boy Emily once loved and more like someone powerful enough to control entire rooms without trying. Emily studied him carefully now. The expensive watch, the perfectly tailored clothes, the people constantly approaching him with respect, the calm confidence. None of it matched the struggling college student she remembered crying beside her in an old pickup truck because he could not afford tuition one semester. How rich are you? She finally asked in almost a whisper. Ethan held her gaze steadily, but before he could answer, every television screen inside the lounge suddenly switched to a breaking business news segment. Emily barely paid attention at first until a familiar photo appeared across the screen beside bold headlines. Brooks Global Tech announces multi-billion-dollar expansion. Emily's breath caught instantly as she slowly turned toward Ethan, whose face was now staring back at her from every television in the room. Emily's eyes widened as she stared at the television screens plastered with Ethan's face and the headline, Brooks Global Tech announces multi-billion-dollar expansion. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs while a mixture of shock, disbelief, and confusion swept over her. Ethan remained standing beside her, calm and composed, as though he had anticipated her reaction. You are a billionaire, she whispered, barely able to form the words. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the screens, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. It appears so, he said quietly, his voice steady and measured. Emily sank into the sofa, staring at him, unable to comprehend how the boy she had loved and mourned for so long had transformed into this figure of immense power and influence. Lily, oblivious to the tension, sat cross-legged on the floor beside her mother, examining her cookie while occasionally glancing up at Ethan with curiosity. Mommy, why is that man on the television? Lily asked innocently. Emily swallowed hard and forced a small smile. That is a very important man, sweetheart. Someone who works very hard. Ethan knelt slightly to Lily's level and said softly, I work hard. Yes, but not for attention. Mostly to build things that help people. Emily watched the interaction silently, still in shock, while Ethan straightened and glanced at her again. Emily, I did not mean to overwhelm you, he said carefully, taking a measured step closer. She shook her head slightly. You do not understand. This is not just overwhelming. This is impossible. He nodded, his blue eyes steady and earnest. I know it seems sudden. I did not plan for you to see it like this. Emily could not speak immediately, her thoughts spinning. 12 years of unanswered questions, pain, and longing collided with the reality of this man standing calmly in front of her, still the boy who had once held her hand and whispered promises she had clung to in her teens. Ethan continued, I wanted to tell you earlier, but it was complicated. Everything was complicated then. She bit her lip and stared down at Lily, who had now wandered back to her side. The little girl's innocent presence made the enormity of Ethan's revelation even more impossible to process. Complicated, Emily echoed softly. You disappeared. I was left alone. I had a child to raise without you. Ethan's expression darkened slightly, and he ran a hand through his hair, something he had never done when they were teenagers. Emily, I never wanted to abandon you. Circumstances. He paused, clearly struggling with which details to reveal first. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted answers. She wanted apologies. She wanted everything she had lost back in a single explanation. But she also wanted to be angry, to protect herself from the vulnerability she felt now. Ethan took a slow step closer, careful not to invade her space, and said softly, I was told things that were not true. I believed you had moved on, and you believed I had left. Her throat tightened, and she looked at him, searching for any sign of deceit. There was none, only the familiar depth in his gaze, the same earnestness she had loved so long ago. Emily swallowed and nodded faintly, her mind spinning, heart aching, and emotions tangled between disbelief, lingering resentment, and an unexplainable longing she had tried to suppress for years. Lily tugged gently at Emily's sleeve. "Mommy, he is nice," she said quietly, and Emily looked down at her daughter's innocent face, realizing in that instant that nothing about this encounter would ever be ordinary again. The revelation of Ethan's wealth was just the beginning of a story she was now forced to confront, one that entwined their past, present, and the child she had raised alone. The lounge had grown quieter as the evening stretched on, but Emily's thoughts only became louder. She sat beside Lily near the massive windows while rain tapped softly against the glass outside, blurring the runway lights into streaks of gold and white. Across the room, Ethan stood near the corner speaking quietly on a phone call, his posture calm and controlled while several employees waited nearby with tablets and documents. Emily watched him carefully, still struggling to connect this powerful man with the boy she once knew. Every person in the room seemed to orbit around him naturally. Flight attendants greeted him by name. Executives waited for his approval before making decisions. Even the lounge staff moved differently when he walked past them. It was impossible to ignore now. Ethan Brooks had become the kind of man who influenced entire companies, maybe entire industries. Yet somehow, he still looked at her the same way he had 12 years ago. That realization unsettled her more than anything else. Lily had fallen asleep against her shoulder, clutching the small teddy bear Ethan bought earlier. Emily brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead and felt emotion tighten painfully in her chest. Ethan returned a few minutes later and quietly sat across from them again. His eyes immediately softened at the sight of Lily sleeping. "She trusts you already," Emily said before she could stop herself. Ethan glanced up slowly. "I would never give her a reason not to." Something about the answer made Emily look away quickly. Silence settled between them again before Ethan finally spoke. "You said you raised her alone." Emily nodded faintly. "Yes." Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "Emily, did you ever tell anyone about me?" Her throat tightened immediately because she knew exactly what he was really asking. She stared out at the rain for several long seconds before answering quietly. "No." Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. "Why not?" Emily let out a shaky breath. "Because I thought you left me." The honesty in her voice hit him instantly. She could see it in his eyes. "After you disappeared, I called you for weeks," she continued softly. "Then one day your father showed up at my apartment." Ethan froze completely. "My father?" Emily nodded slowly. "He told me you were gone and that I needed to stop embarrassing your family by trying to contact you." Ethan stared at her silently now, shock slowly replacing the calm control he usually carried. Emily swallowed hard and continued. "He said you were already building a new life in New York and that you did not want anything tying you down." Ethan stood up so suddenly that Emily startled slightly. He turned away, dragging one hand across his mouth as though trying to process what he had just heard. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, that is not possible." Emily looked up at him carefully. "He also gave me an envelope with cash inside." Ethan slowly turned back toward her, his expression darker now. "What?" "I threw it away," Emily said quickly. "But after that, you never called. You never came back." So I believed him. Ethan looked devastated in a way Emily had never seen before. The powerful billionaire image disappeared completely for a moment, replaced by the same heartbroken young man she remembered from years ago. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice rougher now, "I never knew any of this." She searched his face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but all she saw was genuine shock. Ethan sat back down slowly, staring at the floor for several seconds before speaking again. "My father told me something very different." Emily frowned slightly. Ethan lifted his eyes toward hers. "He told me you met someone else after I moved to New York. He said you were happier without me and wanted me to stay away." Emily's breath caught instantly. "What?" Ethan nodded once, bitterness creeping into his voice for the first time. "I tried calling your old apartment several times. Eventually, the number stopped working." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I lost that apartment after Lily was born." The truth settled painfully between them. Years of love destroyed by lies neither of them knew existed. Ethan looked toward the sleeping child again, and this time his gaze lingered longer than before. Then, very slowly, he asked the question Emily had feared since the moment he first saw Lily. "Emily, is she mine?" Emily froze, her hand instinctively covering Lily as if to shield her from the sudden weight of the question. Ethan's voice was soft but steady. carrying the urgency and vulnerability of someone who had just discovered a truth that could change everything. Emily swallowed hard, her chest tightening as memories and fears collided in her mind. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan's expression shifted almost immediately from shock to a mixture of awe, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. He slowly crouched down to be at eye level with Lily, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Hello, Lily," he said softly, almost reverently. Lily looked up at him with curious eyes, then smiled slightly, unaware of the complexity in the air. Ethan's voice caught on the next words. "I am your father," he said carefully, testing the truth on his tongue before fully embracing it. Emily felt a rush of relief and terror at the same time. She had imagined this moment countless times, sometimes in anger, sometimes in longing, but now it was real. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he reached toward Lily, unsure whether to fully hold her yet, unsure if this fragile moment could be disrupted by his sudden presence in their lives. Lily tilted her head, considering him for only a moment, then slowly reached out her tiny hand to touch his. Ethan's eyes glistened as he held her hand gently, careful not to frighten her, as if learning the contours of her life in that single connection. Emily could hardly breathe, watching the bond form so naturally, so effortlessly, and yet feeling the weight of years they had lost. "Emily," Ethan whispered, turning to her now, his face pale but resolute. "I should have known. I should have fought for this." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You did not know," she said softly. "You were misled. We both were." Ethan nodded, swallowing against the emotion threatening to break him. "I have spent years wondering if I lost everything because of my own choices," he admitted. Emily's hand touched his lightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared pain. "You did not lose her," she said quietly, glancing at Lily, who was now giggling softly at a reflection in the glass. Ethan looked down at their daughter again, awe evident in his expression. "I want to make it right," he said firmly, almost to himself, then louder. "I will make it right. Whatever it takes, Emily. I will be there. Not just for you, but for her too." Emily studied him carefully, seeing both the grown man and the boy she had loved standing in the same body. She could feel the sincerity in his words, the dedication that could finally heal the wounds time had left behind. She nodded slowly, the tight knot of fear in her chest loosening slightly. "It will take time," she said gently. "But maybe we can try." Ethan reached for her hand, holding it with quiet determination. "Time is what I have been waiting for," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. For the first time in over a decade, Emily felt the possibility of hope intertwining with the past, a chance for love, family, and trust to rebuild itself. Outside, the rain began to ease, the streaked runway lights shimmering through the soft drizzle, as though the world itself was offering a small, cautious blessing on this reunion that had seemed impossible just moments before. 6 months later, Emily stood barefoot on the wooden porch of a quiet coastal house overlooking the gray-blue waters of Puget Sound, while the cool evening breeze carried the scent of salt and pine through the air. Inside the house, soft laughter echoed warmly from the living room, and for the first time in years, the sound did not feel temporary. Emily wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and watched through the open doorway as Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, helping Lily build a model airplane across the coffee table. Pieces of plastic and instruction sheets were scattered everywhere, while Lily giggled every time Ethan pretended to struggle with the tiny parts. "Dad, you are doing it wrong again," she teased with dramatic seriousness. Ethan placed a hand over his chest in mock offense. "I am trying my best here." Emily smiled quietly to herself, still amazed by how naturally the word dad now fit into their lives. The months after the airport reunion had not been simple. There had been difficult conversations, painful truths, tears neither of them expected, and moments when old wounds reopened before they could finally begin healing. Ethan had spent weeks slowly earning Lily's trust without forcing himself into her world too quickly. He attended her school science fair even after flying back from Singapore only hours earlier. He learned how she liked her pancakes shaped into stars on Saturday mornings. He sat beside her bed during one of her asthma flare-ups and stayed awake the entire night just listening to her breathe. Emily noticed everything. Not because Ethan was trying to impress her, but because every small action felt genuine. He never tried to buy Lily's affection with wealth or grand gestures. Instead, he showed up consistently in the quiet moments that mattered most. And somehow, that healed Emily more than expensive houses or private flights ever could. Ethan glanced toward the porch and immediately smiled when he saw her standing there. Even now, after all these months, the look in his eyes still made her heart ache in the gentlest way. "You are hiding from us," he called lightly. Emily laughed softly and stepped back inside. "I was enjoying the peace before your airplane crashes into the coffee table." Lily gasped dramatically. "Mom, Dad says I am an engineering genius." Ethan nodded seriously. "I stand by that statement." Emily sat beside them on the floor, and Lily instantly leaned against her side, while Ethan's hand found hers naturally, comfortably, as though the years apart had finally stopped matching. Emily looked down at their intertwined fingers and felt emotion rise quietly in her chest again. There were still scars between them. Some nights, she still woke up afraid this happiness could disappear as suddenly as it had years ago. But Ethan always noticed. Sometimes he simply pulled her closer without words. Sometimes he whispered the same sentence against her forehead before sleep. "I am not leaving again." And for the first time, she believed him completely. Outside, the sky darkened slowly as rain clouds rolled gently over the water, but inside the small house, warmth wrapped itself around them like something sacred. Ethan helped Lily hold the tiny airplane steady while Emily watched them together, memorizing the sight because for so many years she thought this future had been stolen from her forever. Ethan looked up suddenly and caught her staring. "What?" he asked softly. Emily shook her head with a faint emotional smile. "Nothing." But it was not really nothing. Because after years of surviving alone, after years of believing love had abandoned her, Emily finally understood something she never thought life would give her again. Sometimes people lose each other because of lies, timing, and pain they cannot control. But sometimes love survives anyway, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to return home.